I don't know if you saw the debate, but if you did, don't. It was just a train wreck and a disaster, and Biden's approval ratings have plummeted. The Democratic Party is in crisis. He says he's not going to move, and that greatly increases Trump's chances. We all know this person, and he wrote in his book, Mein Kampf, he wrote everything down that he was going to do. So we could never accuse him of not fulfilling his promises. He talked in the book in black and white about Germany's need for more living space, especially to the east. He talked about race. He talked about the superiority of the Aryan race, the inferiority of the Jewish race. There was a Jewish problem that had to be dealt with, and there would be bloodshed. It was all written down in the book. He talked about the destructive nature of democracy and how Germany could not succeed as long as it had democracy. It was all there, all written down, and everyone, the political elite, ignored it. Most of them, I doubt, had read it. It's pretty hard to read. You might be wondering, what's this got to do with what we're talking about? Well, this. This is a 925-page document you may have heard of, which is Trump's agenda. This has been put together by so-called conservative, and I hate that word, extreme right-wing think tanks. That's what they are, extreme right-wing think tanks. They want to extend the power of the president. The public servants, people would no longer serve the government but serve the president. There is stuff in there about rolling back policies that Biden has implemented to try and mitigate the climate catastrophe. That would all go. The environment would be pillaged. He has said he wants to be dictator for a day, and we don't really need the Constitution. He said it, and it's all there, written down, 925 pages. And I'm not sure how many of the political elite have read it, but they should, because it's all there and it's a warning. Now, a good friend of mine who saw the debate said, really, it was the deranged versus the demented. And I thought, well, I'd rather any day have the demented rather than the deranged. Joe Biden did not perform well, and yeah, I think that he should stand aside. But at least if he runs, people have got to vote for him, because if they don't, I think the United States is on the precipice of disaster. And I think on the 1st of July, when the Supreme Court, the extreme right-wing Supreme Court, said that the president in some circumstances had immunity. Now what that does, that creates a king. That creates an office that the founders did their damnedest to avoid. That day will go down in history as January the 6th did. It is a turning point. And in 1974, or actually it was later than that, 77 I think, President Richard Nixon did interviews with David Frost. And during those interviews he said, if the president does it, it's right. And people were horrified, not the current Supreme Court. Current Supreme Court would say, that's fine. So the United States, I don't think we can any longer call a democracy, and I really fear for the future. Now, we might not have as much time for questions at the end because of that little diatribe, but I thought I might share those few thoughts. So let's get back to the man who I think created Trump, which put us in the situation we're in, so that there is a link. We wouldn't be talking about any of this, I think, if it wasn't for Ronald Reagan and other factors. I think Ronald Reagan was a big contributing factor. So allow me to remind myself what we talked about last week, which was social cohesion. And we talked about the three elements that is the glue that holds society together. We talked about legitimacy and how undermining legitimacy undermines social cohesion. And we talked briefly about Ronald Reagan's contribution to that division. So over the next weeks, we're going to delve into Reagan's life, his personality, and the influences that created that personality. And this will give you an understanding about why he became president and implemented policies that created a disengaged, disenchanted, and disillusioned generation. That generation and its children were ready and waiting for a candidate like the real estate developer turned television reality show host. This week, you'll hear about Reagan's childhood, about his early career in radio and his career in Hollywood, as well as his 2 marriages. By the end of the day, you'll have an insight into what made Ronald Reagan, whose policies made Donald Trump. Reagan was born on the 6th of February 1911, and if those of you who are interested in astrology, he was an Aquarian. Those of you who are interested in astrology may be interested to know that more Aquarians have been President of the United States than any other sun sign. Reagan was born at home in a 5-room apartment above a shop and a bank on Main Street, Tampico, Illinois. The apartment didn't have running water or an indoor toilet. It wasn't quite the log cabin of Abraham Lincoln's story, but it was a more modern version. Reagan's nickname, until he arrived in Hollywood, was Dutch. When he was running for governor of California, he wrote an autobiography, Where Is the Rest of Me? Reagan wrote that after his birth, his father, John, known as Jack, said, "For such a little bit of a fat Dutchman, he makes a hell of a lot of noise, doesn't he?" Reagan portrayed his parents as opposites attracting. Here they are with Ronald, circled there. It's a bit, not a great quality photo, but you can get the idea. So he's with his elder brother there, whose name was Neil. Jack was an Irish Catholic storytelling charmer and chain smoker who had a problem with alcohol. Some biographers say he was an alcoholic, others say he was a binge drinker. He could be moody, cynical and stubborn. Reagan's mother, Nell, was a Scot-English Protestant who was sunny, idealistic, understanding. But she was also a Bible-thumping, teetotaling do-gooder. They were opposites, but one thing they had in common was their immigrant roots and desire to improve their lives. A typical American story. People determined to change their lives for the better, to leave their impoverished past behind them. Reagan wrote they had a burning ambition to succeed. Well, their ambition wasn't realised. The Great Depression hit the Farm Belt hard, which is where the Reagans were living. Jack's drinking became more of a problem during the Depression years, and Nell became more religious. The family took in boarders, and Nell did sewing. In the evenings, she read stories to her sons from books such as The Three Musketeers and The Knights of the Round Table, and Jack would read his newspaper. This could be where Reagan's love of words and storytelling began. He did well at school. One of his teachers noted that he had a photographic memory. Compensation perhaps for his nearsightedness. When he was 15, he got a summer job as a construction worker. And the next year, he was a lifeguard in Dixon, where he spent 6 summers. On the 3rd of August 1928, he was on the front page of the Dixon Telegraph newspaper for rescuing a drowning man. That man was one of 77 lives Ronald Reagan saved during his career as a lifesaver. Jack Reagan died on the 18th of May 1941. He was 57. The cause of death was a heart attack. Now, it seems that Hollywood, back in 1941, which is where the Reagans were living at the time, was having similar ambulance problems to what we do. Reagan folklore has it that Jack died waiting for an ambulance. Because of a dispute about jurisdictions, the closest ambulance didn't respond. Years later, Reagan told his daughter Maureen that he was beyond crying when his father died. My soul was just desolate. That's the only word I can use. Desolate and empty. But the emotional pain was short-lived. He told Maureen that Jack had spoken to him after he had died and assured him that all was well and not to worry. Reagan said the desolation lifted immediately. When Reagan graduated from university, he didn't seem to have a clear idea about what he wanted to do. In his autobiography, he wrote that he had a secret ambition to act since he won a prize for acting at college. But he didn't want to tell people in the conservative Midwest where jobs like acting were looked down on. And he'd seen several sports announcers play themselves in movies and thought there was a remote possibility for him to do the same. One of the themes of Reagan's life is the help that he received from others. One of the first was a Kansas businessman who became Reagan's mentor and encouraged him to get a job in radio. Now, radio in the 1930s was what the movies are today. Radio personalities were celebrities. In the autumn of 1932, Reagan went to Chicago in search of a job in radio and his fortune. He wanted to work for one of the two biggest radio networks, the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, or the Columbia Broadcasting System. The NBC program director told him to get a job in a smaller city. Chicago was the big time, and no one wanted to take a risk on an inexperienced person. Well, Reagan took the advice and went to a radio station in Davenport, a small city in Illinois. The station's program manager, Peter MacArthur, was impressed by Reagan's delivery and gave him a trial before employing him. MacArthur became Reagan's mentor, another beneficial relationship. In March 1933, President Roosevelt gave the first of his fireside chats you may have heard of. Roosevelt was quick to recognise the power of radio that enabled him to connect with citizens in their living rooms, a possibility that had not existed before. Reagan idolised Roosevelt. His strong, gentle, confident voice resonated across the nation with an eloquence that brought comfort and resilience to a nation caught up in a storm and reassured us we could lick any problem. Well, the Roosevelt administration's New Deal certainly licked the Reagan family's financial problems. Reagan's father, Jack, and brother Neil were both out of work. In June 1933, though, Reagan's father got a job in the Dixon office of the newly created Federal Emergency Relief Administration. In November, Neil Reagan was appointed a district representative of the Federal Re-Employment Bureau. Now, it's ironic that Reagan's father and brother were the beneficiaries of a government job creation program, because when Reagan was president, he cut funding to many similar programs. Reagan's mentor, Peter MacArthur, was transferred to another radio station in the company owned in Des Moines, Iowa's capital. He took Reagan with him to be the station's chief sports announcer. Now, Reagan's salary, in today's Australian dollars, was $7,300 a month. It was later raised to $108,000 a month. That's $129,600 a year in today's Australian dollars. Not bad for a 21-year-old. By 1934, Reagan was well known as Dutch Reagan sports announcer. He announced football games, swimming meets, track meets and car races. He had his own show, the T-Berry Sports Review, that aired twice a day. He interviewed sports stars and sometimes celebrities. But he was best known for covering football games from Chicago's Wrigley Field. He visited once. He covered the game from the radio station's Des Moines studio in Iowa. A telegraph operator in the Chicago Stadium press box typed in Morse code what was happening. An operator in the Des Moines studio, who sat opposite Reagan, translated and passed on the information. From these brief snippets, Reagan would call the game. This was a really important skill that he learnt early on. So you're seeing here that he's developing a skill of storytelling. So the Des Moines Dispatch newspaper reported in August 1934, "The voice of Dutch Reagan is a daily source of baseball dope. Every afternoon at 2 o'clock, Dutch goes on air with his rapid-fire play-by-play visualisation of the home games of Chicago's Major League Baseball teams, the Cubs and the Sox." Civic organisations asked him to give speeches, and the Dispatch newspaper made him a columnist. Reagan was quite the man about the Des Moines town that was home to 145,000 people. He was a big fish in a small pond. But, as one of his biographers, Bob Colacello, wrote, "As the fish grew bigger, the pond seemed smaller." Hollywood beckoned. Reagan arrived in Tinseltown in May 1937 at the age of 26. The Hollywood in which Reagan arrived was described by Colacello as a city of upward mobility, self-innovation, hedonism and fundamentalism, the mecca of beauty, psychics, evangelists, rich retirees fleeing boredom, desperation. Hollywood was the land of the white picket fence and the kidney-shaped swimming pool, of the open shop and the gated community, where the myth of the American dream was invented by the Eastern European moguls who ran Hollywood. Reagan presented himself at Warner Brothers, and the casting director, Maxano, ordered an assistant to take him to the wardrobe department for more suitable clothes. The white sports coat and blue trousers Reagan was wearing weren't deemed appropriate. The makeup department virtually told him he wasn't physically suitable. His head was too small, he needed a new hairstyle, which they gave him. Wardrobe said his shoulders were too wide and neck too short. They sent him to Jimmy Cagney's shirt maker for custom-made shirts with trick collars, which he continued to have made for the rest of his life. But that wasn't all that was wrong. The publicity department didn't like the name Dutch, by which millions of Midwesterners knew him from his radio broadcasts. When the publicists heard his name was Ronald Reagan, they were delighted. They wouldn't have to change his name. His was perfect. It had a lovely alliterative symmetry and was easy to remember. So not long after arriving in Hollywood, he met gossip columnist Luella Parsons. She was also from Dixon, Illinois, and they took an immediate liking to each other. Here again is someone else who was a great help to Reagan. She took every opportunity to promote him in her daily newspaper column in the Los Angeles Examiner. The column was syndicated to 600 newspapers worldwide. So that's fantastic exposure. But Miss Parsons' enthusiastic promotion of her friend didn't break the pattern of Reagan's first 4 years in Hollywood. He was cast in B-grade movies and given occasional supporting roles in A-League productions. B-grade movies were low-budget productions shown in cinemas as the second feature. Jane Wyman was described as a little, loud, brassy blonde by Luella Parsons. And she was a high school dropout, a former chorus girl, a divorcee, and she was only 21. Hopper declared Jane Wyman was eager to please, but also touchy and tough and impulsive. She was born Sarah Jane Mansfield in St. Joseph, Missouri on the 5th of January 1917. Her parents separated when she was 5, and she met Reagan in June 1937. She said that from the first moment she saw him, she thought to herself, "That's for me." They were in a movie together from July to August 1938, and it was the first movie in which either had a principal role. Reagan's mother had reservations. She wrote to a friend, "I hope my Ronald has made the right choice. I was in hopes he would fall in love with some sweet girl who wasn't in the movies." She wasn't the only one who had reservations about the match. A friend said, "Sure, everyone respected his clean living ways and his solid character, but he was, well, rather square, serious, respectful of women, steady of mind and manners. He was a very sexy looking man, of course, but he was a little earthbound for someone like Jane." Reagan had no such reservations, and nor did Louella Parsons. She announced in her column in October 1938 the engagement of two of Hollywood's nicest young people. The wedding was on the 26th of January 1940, and the reception was at Louella Parsons' Beverly Hills home. "1940 was a great year for the 29-year-old Ronald Reagan. In that year he married, and he starred in the movie that made him famous, from which he got another nickname. The movie was Reagan's idea. It would be based on George Gipper, who died from a strep infection in 1920 when he was 25. He was a footballer, and Warner Brothers were enthusiastic about the idea, but weren't enthusiastic about Reagan playing Gip. Reagan had to fight to get the part. Colaccillo writes that he probably wouldn't have got the role had it not been for another influential friend. Another example of Reagan getting help from others who have more power and influence than him. The most famous scene in the movie is when the Gip, whose nickname was the Gipper, lay dying, and he urged his teammates to win one for the Gipper. But from then on it became another nickname for Reagan, who used it in political campaigns. He asked people to win one for the Gipper. In 1941, life continued to go well for the Reagans. Their first child, Maureen, was born on the 4th of January, and that autumn their agent renegotiated their contracts with Warner Brothers and tripled their salaries overnight. Reagan's new salary was, in today's Australian dollars, $34,000 and Jane Wyman, $31,000. Now that's $411,600 a year for him and $374,400 for her. It's not bad salaries, is it? They were both elected to the Screen Actors Guild Board and bought a house in the Hollywood Hills that had huge picture windows to make the most of the panoramic views of the Pacific Ocean to Los Angeles. By the end of 1941, Reagan was getting leading roles in A-grade movies. That year, a Gallup poll rated Reagan 82nd of the top 100 stars. By the start of 1942, he tied in 74th place with Laurence Olivier. Gallup estimated he was earning, in 1942, in today's Australian dollars, $1.5 million a film. But that wasn't much. That wasn't much compared to Errol Flynn. Now, I don't know if we haven't got time to go into Errol Flynn, but besides other things, he was a Nazi sympathising pedophile. But he was... and maybe in a later session I'll tell you what I really think. So Errol Flynn was earning $5 million a movie, and remember this is in today's Australian dollars, and Clark Gable, the box office king, got $6.6 million per movie, not per year, per movie. The US Army called Reagan up in August 1941 to report for active duty. But he was in the middle of filming, so he got a deferment, and he received 2 more deferments after that. The head of Warner Brothers had plans for Reagan, and Warner tried to pull strings in Washington. He wanted Reagan for the lead role in Casablanca. Don't know if any of you are familiar with Casablanca, but it's rather good that he didn't get it. But Warner obviously didn't get his way. Although Reagan was disqualified for active duty because of poor eyesight, he was given a role in the army. His first 7 weeks were spent as a liaison officer loading convoys with troops bound for Australia. Warner lobbied the Roosevelt administration to support him to set up a special unit to produce what we would call propaganda films. The result was the first motion picture unit of the Army Corps, which was set up at Warner Brothers Studio. Reagan was transferred to the picture unit, so he was back at home. He later quipped he flew a desk during the war. He made propaganda movies, Target Tokyo, Beyond the Line of Duty, and For God and Country, among others. And the titles give you an idea of what the content would have been like. The war changed the world, and it changed Ronald Reagan. He had always been politically opinionated, and during the war those opinions changed. He was already on what we would now call the progressive side of politics. During the war he moved that way and became what we would call a Liberal Democrat. After the war, the movie roll offers dwindled. One movie, Stallion Road, began shooting in April 1946, and it rekindled Reagan's passion for horses. He bought a ranch and went into horse breeding with a friend. His phone often rang with offers of roles which he described as being, quote, "They don't want them good, they want them Thursday." In March 1945, the Reagans adopted a boy, Michael, and on the surface they were one happy family. But Jane was restless and growing tired of her staid stick-in-the-mud husband. In 1947, she gave birth to a girl, Christine, who died 9 hours later. She became depressed, and the tragedy didn't bring the couple closer, but pushed them apart. Jane was tired of the endless political debates with their friends, his late nights at the Screen Actors Guild, his foreign policy lectures at breakfast when all she wanted to do was get ready to go to work. She once said, "Don't ask Ronnie what time it is because he will tell you how a watch is made." In 1947, she asked for a divorce which shocked and horrified him. Luella Parsons wrote, "No marital separation since I broke the story that Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart, was leaving Douglas Fairbanks has had the effect of the parting of the Reagans." Just as Mary and Doug stood for all that is best in this town, so have Ronnie and Jane. To those of us who are close friends, they were an ideal Mr. and Mrs. That's why this hurts so much. As her marriage was falling apart, Jane Wyman concentrated on her career and her dedication paid off. She won the Best Actress Academy Award in 1949 for her role as a deaf-mute rape victim in Johnny Belinda. Meanwhile, Reagan's communication skills were being noticed. A friend of his, who was close to him in the 40s, was a drug tycoon, Justin Dart. Here again is another person who's got power and influence, from whose friendship Reagan benefited. Justin Dart said Reagan wasn't the most brilliant man I've ever met, but he was an exceptional communicator who could get to his feet and influence people. He could sell people on what's good for them, know just what they want. As Reagan was hoping for a reconciliation with Jane Wyman, an ambitious woman arrived in Hollywood. Nancy Davis, formerly Nancy Robbins. She was an actor whose ambition did not match her talent. But she had a talent for getting what she wanted. When a talent spotter from the Metro studio saw Nancy in a television drama, he rang her and invited her to take a screen test. She wrote in her autobiography, "This was one opportunity that none of my family or friends had anything to do with." The next telephone call she made was to her mother, Edith. Now, Edith was a one-time actor who abandoned her career, but not her contacts. When she realised she wasn't going to be the success she expected to be, one of those contacts was Spencer Tracy. Edith rang him and asked him to make sure Nancy was treated with kid gloves. But Warner Brothers' head of talent had Nancy's number. I knew, everyone knew, that she would never be a star. But she was given a 6-month contract. In the publicity information about her, she reduced her age by 2 years and said her greatest ambition was to have a successful and happy marriage. She compiled a list of eligible men that included directors, producers, agents, actors, and the president of the Screen Actors Guild, Ronald Reagan. Reagan and Wyman divorced in 1948, but they dined regularly together to discuss their children. She seemed to play with his hopes of reconciliation. She told journalists in October 1949, 4 months after the divorce was finalised, she would wear to the premiere of her latest movie a dress he had given her. Reagan was not doing well without a romantic partner. "I just can't get it right," he told Doris Lilly, whom he was dating. "I'm no good alone." He proposed to her, but she refused him because she knew he wasn't in love. She said he wanted someone who was willing to make the big moves, push, be there, encourage him, never leave him alone for a moment. I couldn't do it. In autumn 1949, Nancy Davis asked a friend to invite Reagan to a dinner party. Nancy sat opposite, smiled a lot and nodded agreement at everything Reagan said, much of it about the evils of communism. But as is customary, he did not call her after the dinner party. And the days went by and the phone didn't ring. So she rang him. She wanted to inquire about being a candidate for the Screen Actors Guild board elections in November that year. He didn't return the call. Then she got unexpected help from a very unlikely source. 1949, as you probably know, was the height of the McCarthy era. It was the name given to a shameful period in United States history triggered by Senator Eugene McCarthy. He alleged there were communists working in the State Department, and that spread to everywhere else. That's another incredible story. He chaired a congressional committee that waged a witch hunt that spread to Hollywood. Flimsy allegations that someone might be a communist ruined many careers. Being seen with someone who was thought to be a communist was enough to break your career. When the Hollywood Reporter newspaper published the names of supporters of convicted communists, Nancy Davis was beside herself. Her name was one of them. The director of the film on which she was working was a friend. She asked him to ring Reagan to find out if he could do anything to help. He didn't call Nancy, but he called the director of the film and told him the Nancy Davis in the newspaper report was another actor. It was a case of mistaken identity. Nancy had no reason to worry, he told the director, and in any case the Guild would support her. She appealed to the director to call Reagan back to ask him if he could ring to explain it to her personally. It would make her feel so much better. You can imagine the anguish and the pain she'd been through. So the director was influential. And so Reagan, because of that, Reagan didn't want to get him offside. So he rang Nancy. and asked her if she was free for dinner that evening. Well, despite the short notice, as it happened, she was free. According to their separate accounts of that first date, they hit it off immediately. He was impressed and she was mesmerised. She later wrote, "One of the things I liked about Ronnie was that he didn't talk only about himself. And when he did talk about himself, it was personal, without being too personal." In the introduction of a book of their love letters published on their 50th wedding anniversary, Nancy Reagan wrote, "When the real thing comes along, you just know it. At least I did. I loved to listen to him talk. I loved his sense of humour. I saw it very clearly that first night. He was everything I wanted." Despite not liking being single, Reagan was reluctant to commit, and the couple dated other people during most of 1950, but they saw each other now and again. Jane Wyman was still in the wings of Reagan's life. She went to his 39th birthday dinner, along with 600 other friends. Nancy was dating other men at the same time. Some of them proposed. But meanwhile, she was having riding lessons. Not sure why that would be. And she allowed herself to have a weak cocktail or two when Reagan took her out to dinner. She achieved her goal of becoming a Screen Actors Guild board member in October 1950. It meant she saw Reagan at meetings every Monday night. Now, I wouldn't want you to think that her motivation for wanting to be on the Screen Guild Actors Board was anything other than to contribute to it. After meetings, Reagan and Nancy sometimes went in the company of others for a drink. Board meetings were not always harmonious discussions before coming to an agreement. The perceived communist threat and its terrible consequences of career and reputation loss were ever present. Reagan had become a Guild board member in June 1941 and he was elected president of the Guild in March 1947. He was elected for a one-year term and re-elected 5 times. On the 17th of November 1947, the Guild voted to force its officers to take a non-communist pledge. A few days later, Reagan and other Guild officials testified before McCarthy's committee, the House of Un-American Activities. So days before they'd made the pledge, so they could say to the committee, well, we're all patriotic Americans, we're certainly not communists. The Guild pledge, a loyalty pledge, was similar to what other organisations had implemented. It was considered necessary for loyal Americans to swear their allegiance to the country. That is the damage, part of the damage that McCarthy had caused. Now, Nancy didn't recall tension at Guild board meetings. She told biographer Colacello, "I don't remember any tension. Maybe it's my memory, or that I was falling in love." Isn't it sweet? Colacello asked her if she thought there had been a Soviet Union plan to infiltrate Hollywood. She said, "Damn right there was," and they were trying to get their message into the movies. Nancy was able to see Reagan's leadership style close up, the way he took advice, how he was influenced, dealt with opposition, made decisions and reached consensus. She used this knowledge to great effect later in his political leadership roles. Reagan was Screen Actors Guild president until 1952. One of his achievements was to get television actors Saturdays off. They were working a 6-day week. In 1946, Richard Nixon ran for Congress. Everyone's heard of him, haven't they? Reagan supported Nixon's Democratic Party opponent, but in 1950, when Nixon was the Republican Party candidate for a Californian Senate seat, Reagan had swapped sides and supported Nixon. When Reagan asked a friend to a party he was hosting for Nixon, the friend asked, "Isn't he a Republican?" Reagan responded, "I've switched. I sat down and made a list of the people I know, and the most admired people I know are Republicans." That tells you a lot about him, doesn't it? That was one of the contributing factors for his change of allegiance. Nancy was another. And there's another story that he tells about that change of allegiance we'll come to in later weeks. Her mother and stepfather, that's Nancy's mother and stepfather, were staunch right-wing Republicans. In 1951, Reagan increased his anti-communist activities. He made speeches for anti-communist organisations, and when he wasn't acting or giving speeches, he was with Nancy. Hollywood newspapers described the couple as an every-night item. Nancy made sure she got on with Reagan's children, Maureen, who in 1951 was 10, and Michael, who was 6. When the 4 of them were at Reagan's ranch, Nancy happily did one of the chores Maureen hated, whitewashing a redwood fence Reagan was building. Michael liked the way Nancy would massage his back on their ride to the ranch. Michael later wrote, "She was always cheerful, unlike Mum, who had constant mood shifts." Nancy Davis and Ronald Reagan married on the 4th of March 1952. Their first child, this might shock you, their first child was born on the 21st of October. So married in March and the baby was born in October. Their second child, Ron, was born in May 1958. Kitty Kelly, who wrote an unauthorised and damning biography of Nancy Davis, says she trapped Reagan into marriage. But another biographer, Karen Tumulty, in her book, The Triumph of Nancy Reagan, denies the implication. Reagan's movie career was languishing by 1954. That year, the General Electric company was looking for a host for its languishing television show, General Electric Theatre. The company sponsored a weekly half-hour drama and was on the lookout for a host. So the host would introduce the program for the evening. So the program could be a movie, or it could be a documentary, it could be anything, but the host would make some introductory comments about it and, tell people what was coming up. One of General Electric's public relations executives explained that the host they wanted was that they wanted a very, very definitive as to the kind. They were very, very definitive as to the kind of person they wanted. Or very particular. They wanted good moral character, intelligent, not the kind with a reputation for the social ramble. A good, upright kind of person. That person would introduce each week's show, as I said, but another duty was to tour the country for 16 weeks a year and make speeches, which was part of the company's employee and community relations program. Reagan, however, had vowed he would never do television. Like most movie actors, he looked down on the small screen. And television wasn't what it is today with streaming and all that sort of thing. Its status has risen considerably. But Reagan's lack of movie roles had forced Nancy to go back to the big screen, go back to work to maintain their lifestyle. Reagan later said the speech making for General Electric was the clincher for him. But maybe the salary might have had something to do with it too. In today's Australian dollars, $2.1 million a year for 5 years. So it's not a bad deal, is it? So the role did 3 things for Reagan. First, it rescued him financially. Second, it resuscitated his career, and it laid the foundations for his political career. No, we're doing quite well for time. So next week we'll have a look at an entertaining clip from one of the General Electric show's ads. And now I'd like to remind myself about what we covered this week. We talked about Reagan's childhood. We looked at his radio career and then his movie and acting career in Hollywood. And we talked about his 2 marriages. So what we've talked about today are formative influences that greatly helped him establish his political career. So this early period, he was accumulating the skills on which he built and used in his political career. And he wouldn't have gotten into movies or given the radio job or the General Electric job had he not had a natural talent for communication. This was one of his great gifts. His greatest gift, probably. I think it was something he was probably born with, and as I said, developed through those earlier jobs. Now, next week, I'll tell you about the start of Reagan's political career and what set him on the path of the presidency and the foundations of his ideology that contributed to the rise of Trump. We'll look at Reagan's role at General Electric and how it contributed to his start in politics, and then we'll look at a speech, a major speech, that historians say Reagan gave his start on the national political stage. Reagan himself referred to it as the speech. And then we'll talk about his campaign and 2 terms as the Governor of California. So, does anyone have any comments, queries or criticisms? Yes?
Did he keep his photographic memory, and what would his IQ be?
So this gentleman asked about his photographic memory. Can you...
His life, you mentioned he had a
Yes, well, that teacher thought he had a photographic memory, but in my reading there wasn't a great lot of reference to it. I think IQ, intelligent quotient, is an interesting concept. And some people disagree that it's a measure of intelligence, and what do we actually mean by intelligence? I think that Ronald Reagan was exceptionally smart. I think in an intellectual sense he wasn't. He had no intellectual curiosity. But he was smart enough to know his limitations, and that is a big thing that a lot of people don't know. They don't know their limitations. You've probably heard of the Peter Principle, where you get to a point where you're no longer competent. Well, he knew when he got to that point, and that's why he had very smart people around him. And as an actor, he knew that the director made him look good. That's why he always did what the director said. So the lighting, the moves, everything an actor does, he knew that. And so the presidency was, being Governor of California and President of the United States were just other roles. And as I said, he had people around him that I'm sure he readily would agree were intellectually more capable than him. But he didn't have a problem with that. Ian?
With the MacArthur era, was that supported by both the Democrats and the Republicans of America at that time?
Yeah.
And where did Reagan come into it? Was he well known as a MacArthur supporter?
Oh, yeah, McCarthy. Yes, he was, and he was a virulent anti-communist, extremely anti-communist, to the point where even when he was running for the presidency, that was, in some quarters, was seen as a bit of a negative because he was so anti-communist. Yes?
I'm very interested to learn that Ronald Reagan was a Democrat.
Yeah.
So what that says to me when he moved to the GOP was that he was a very cynical man. He was ambitious but perhaps very cynical, and that his political views were not held strongly, that he would change them to suit his own purpose.
Yeah, so the comment was that questioning the sincerity of Reagan's political views, that he changed from being a Liberal Democrat to a hardline, hard-right Republican, although probably not as hard-right as some of them. Look, I'm not sure about that. I think that he was sincere about his devotion to the Democratic Party. The New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal, which was basically government intervention to stimulate the economy, did some great things, and he could see that, but government, as we know, is not perfect, and we know it's renowned for wastage and stupid decisions and all that sort of thing. And I think there were a few of them along the line that may have influenced him as well. And I think that, when he said that the people around him, or the people that he admired the most, were all Republicans, it was probably quite true. And I think also that he was very money conscious indeed, and was determined to make a lot of money, and was rather put out about the taxes that that he had to pay, because he'd earned this money, so why should he have to pay taxes? But and I think that would have been an influence as well. Anybody else? Yes. I'll come back to you.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Now, last year you gave a very good lecture on Nancy Davis,
Yes.
coming out with all her lies and deceptions. It's a shame you didn't have the time to put it into this, because that really was a good thing to see before you saw your lecture today.
Yes.
That was an absolute eye-opener to me, that one.
Yeah, well, she was a complete piece of work. But the gentleman's referring to a kaleidoscope, I think it was, I did about Nancy Robbins Davis Reagan, which is a really interesting life. And she, look, there's debate about whether she manipulated him, whether she was the power behind the throne. I think she certainly had a big influence on him. She absolutely did. But I think there were times when he just dug his heels in and said no. So I don't think he was completely in her, completely entranced. And, I don't think that he did everything that she wanted. But she was certainly an influence in the hiring and firing of people, and she was recognised as a power in the White House. Some people dreaded the phone ringing. Yes, sorry.
I was just wondering, during the McCarthy era, there were various actors who put forward names, dobbed in people.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if Reagan was one of those, saying, accused others of being communist.
Yeah, the question was, had Reagan dobbed in other people suspected of being communists to this dreadful McCarthy committee? I'm not sure about that. In my reading, I haven't found any evidence of that. So I suspect maybe not. But it was an hysterical. There was an hysterical time, paranoia, and it was just shocking. It was a milder version of what had happened in the past in the Soviet Union, and other, totalitarian countries where there's, been mass hysteria, and McCarthy created that and sustained it for far too long. People killed themselves over that. Yeah.
In his early years, Reagan was very supportive of the Battlers, and that would have been when he was sort of a Democrat at that time. And then he kept it sort of in his ethos.
Yeah, I think as he started to earn more money and mixed in those circles, that was certainly an influence. And as I said, I get the impression that he was pretty tight, with money. It wasn't. Neither of them were generous people. Yeah. Okay, well, look, we're finishing a bit earlier. Thank you very much for coming along, and I'll look forward to sharing your company next week. Thank you.